History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5, The Making of the European Age. Chapter 6, Ideas Old and New. The essence of the civilization Europe was exporting to the rest of the globe lay in ideas. The limits they imposed and the possibilities they offered shaped the way in which that civilization operated, its style, and the way it saw itself. What is more, although the 20th century has done great damage to them, the leading ideas adumbrated by Europeans between 1500 and 1800 still provide most of the signposts by which we make our way. European culture was then given a secular foundation. It was then, too, that there took hold a progressive notion of historical development as movement towards an apex at which Europeans felt themselves to stand. Finally, it was then that there grew up a confidence that scientific knowledge used in accordance with utilitarian criteria would make possible limitless progress. In short, the civilization of the Middle Ages at last came to an end in the minds of thinking men and women. For all that, things rarely happened clearly and neatly in history, and few Europeans would have been aware of this change by 1800. In a couple of centuries, there had been little movement in the way. Most of them understood and behaved. The traditional institutions of monarchy, hereditary status, society, and religion still held sway over millions in that year. Only 100 years before, there had been no civil marriage anywhere in Europe, and there was still none over most of it. Barely 20 years before 1800, the last heretic had been burnt in Poland, and even in England, an 18th century monarch had, like medieval kings, touched for the king's evil. The 17th century indeed had, in one or two respects, even shown regression. In both Europe and North America, there was an epidemic of witch hunting far more widespread than anything in the Middle Ages. Charlemagne had condemned witch burners to death, and canon law had forbidden belief in the night flights and other supposed pranks of witches as pagan. Nor was this the end of superstition. The last English wizard was harried to his death by his neighbors well after 1700, and a Protestant Swiss was legally executed by his countrymen for witchcraft in 1782. The Neapolitan cult of Saint Januarius was still of political importance in the era of French Revolution because the successful or unsuccessful liquefaction of the saint's blood was believed to indicate divine pleasure or displeasure at what the government was doing. Penology was still barbarous. Some crimes were thought so atrocious as to permit punishment of exceptional ferocity, and it was as parricides that the assassination of Henry IV of France and the attempted assassination of Louis XV suffered their abominable torments. The second died under them in 1757, only a few years before the publication of the most influential advocacy of penal reform that has ever been written. The glitter of modernity in the 18th century can easily deceive us. In societies which produced art of exquisite refinement and outstanding examples of chivalry and honor, popular amusements focused on the pleasures of bear baiting, cockfighting, or pulling the heads off geese. If popular culture often shows most obviously the weight of the past, until almost the end of these 3 centuries, much of the formal and institutional apparatus which upheld the past also remained intact over most of Europe. The most striking example to modern eyes would be the primacy still enjoyed almost everywhere in the 18th century by organized religion. In every country, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox alike. Even ecclesiastical reformers took it for granted that religion should be upheld and protected by the law and the coercive apparatus of the state. Only a few advanced thinkers questioned this. In much of Europe, there was still no toleration for views other than those of the established church. The coronation oath taken by a French king imposed on him the obligation to stamp out heresy, and only in 1787 did non Catholic Frenchmen gain any recognized civic status, and therefore the right to legitimize their children by contracting legal marriage. In Catholic countries, the censorship, though often far from effective, was still supposed and sometimes strove to prevent the dissemination of writings inimical to Christian belief and the authority of the Church. Although the Counter Reformation spirit had ebbed and the Jesuits were dissolved, the Index of Prohibited Books and the Inquisition, which had first compiled it, were maintained. The universities everywhere were in clerical hands, even in England. Oxford and Cambridge were closed to nonconformist dissenters and Roman Catholics. Religion also largely determined the content of their teaching and the definition of the studies they pursued. The institutional fabric of society, it is true, showed also the onset of innovation. One of the reasons why universities lost importance in these centuries was that they no longer monopolized the intellectual life of Europe. From the middle of the 17th century, there appeared in many countries, and often under the highest patronage, academics and learned societies such as the English Royal Society, which was given a charter in 1662, or the French Académie des Sciences, founded 4 years later. In the 18th century, such associations greatly multiplied. They were diffused through smaller towns and founded with more limited and special aims, such as the promotion of agriculture. A great movement of voluntary socialization was apparent, though most obvious in England and France. It left few countries in Western Europe untouched. Clubs and societies of all sorts were a characteristic of an age no longer satisfied to exhaust its potential in the social institutions of the past, and they sometimes attracted the attention of government. Some of them made no pretension to have as their sole end literary, scientific, or agricultural activity, but provided gatherings and meeting places at which general ideas were debated, discussed, or merely chatted about. In this way, they assisted the circulation of new ideas. Among such associations, the most remarkable was the International Brotherhood of Freemasons. It was introduced from England to continental Europe in the 1720s and within half a century spread widely. There may have been more than a quarter million Masons by 1789. They were later to be the object of much calumny. The myth was propagated that they had long had revolutionary and subversive aims. This was not true of the craft as a body, however, true it may have been of a few individual Masons, but it is easy to believe that for so far as Masonic lodges, like other gatherings, helped in the publicity and discussion of new ideas, they contributed to the breaking up of the ice of tradition and convention. This increased circulation of ideas and information did not, of course, rest primarily on such meetings, but on the diffusion of the written word through print. One of the crucial transformations of Europe after 1500 was that it became more literate. Some have summed it up as the change from a culture focused on the image to one focused on the word. Reading and writing, especially the former, though not universally diffused but nevertheless became widespread and in some places common. They were no longer the privileged and arcane knowledge of a small elite, nor were they any longer mysterious in being intimately and specially connected with religious rites. In assessing this change, we can emerge a little way from the realm of imponderables and enter that of immeasurable data, which shows that somehow, for all the large pools of illiteracy which still existed in 1800, Europe was by then a literate society as it was not in 1500. That is, of course, not a very helpful statement as it stands. There are many degrees of attainment in both reading and writing. Nevertheless, however, we define our terms. Europe and its dependencies in 1800 probably contained most of the literate people of the world. It therefore had a higher proportion of literates than other cultures. This was a critical historical change. By then, Europe was well into the age of predominance of print, which eventually superseded for most educated people the spoken word and images as the primary means of instruction and direction, and lasted until the 20th century restored over oral and visual supremacy by means of radio, cinema, and television. The sources for assessing literacy are not good until the middle of the 19th century, when it appears somewhere about half of all Europeans still could neither read or write. But they all suggest that the improvement from about 1500 was cumulative but uneven. There were important differences between countries, between the same countries at different periods, between town and country, between the sexes, and between occupations. All this is still true, though in diminished degree, and it greatly simplifies the problem of making general statements. None but the vaguest are possible until recent times, but specific facts are suggestive about trends. The first signs of the educational effort underlying the increase of literacy can be seen before the invention of printing. They appear to be another part of that revival and invigoration of urban life between the 20th and 13th centuries, whose importance has already been noted. Some of the earliest evidence of the commissioning of schoolmasters and provision of school places comes from the Italian cities, which were then the vanguard of European civilization. In them, there soon appears a new appreciation that literacy is an essential qualification for certain kinds of office. We find, for example, provisions that judges should be able to read, a fact with interesting implications for the history of earlier times. The early lead of the Italian cities had given way by the 17th century to that of England and the Netherlands, both countries with, for the age, a high level of urbanization. These have been thought to be the European countries with the highest levels of literacy in about 1700. The transfer of leadership to them illustrates the way in which the history of rising literacy is geographically an uneven business. Yet French was to be the international language of 18th century publication, and the bedrock of the public which sustained this must surely have been found in France. It would not be surprising if levels of literacy were higher in England and the United Provinces, but the numbers of literate may be larger in France, where the total population was so much bigger. An outstanding place in the overall trend to literacy must surely be given to the spread of printing. By the 17th century, there was in existence a corpus of truly popular publishing represented in fairy stories, tales of true and unrequited love, almanacs, and books of astrology, hagiographies. The existence of such material is evidence of demand. Printing had given a new point to being literate too, for the consultation of manuscripts had necessarily been difficult and time consuming. Because of their relative inaccessibility, technical knowledge could now be made available in print very quickly, and this meant that it was in the interest of the specialist to read in order to maintain his skill in his craft. Another force making for literacy was the Protestant Reformation. Almost universally, the reformers themselves stressed the importance of teaching believers how to read. It is no coincidence that by the 19th century, Germany and Scandinavia both reached higher levels of literacy than many Catholic countries. The Reformation made it important to read the Bible, and it had rapidly become available in print in the vernaculars, which were thus strengthened and disciplined by the diffusion and standardization which print brought with it. Bibliolatry, for all its more obviously unfortunate manifestations, was a great force for enlightenment. It was both a stimulus to reading and a focus for intellectual activity. In England and Germany, its importance in making of a common culture can hardly be exaggerated. And in each country, it produced a translation of the Bible which was a masterpiece. As the instance of the reformers shows, authority was often in favor of greater literacy, but this was not confined to the Protestant countries. In particular, the legislators of innovating monarchies in the 18th century often strove to promote education, which meant, in large measure, primary education. Austria and Prussia were notable in this respect. Across the Atlantic, the Puritan tradition had from the start imposed in the New England communities the obligation to provide schooling. In other countries, education was left to the informal and unregulated operation of private enterprise and charity, as in England, or to the church. From the 16th century begins the great age of particular religious orders devoted to teaching, as in France. An important consequence, promoter, and concomitant of increased literacy was the rise of the periodical press. From broadsheets and occasional printed newsletters, there evolved by the 18th century journals of regular publication. They met various needs. Newspapers began in 17th century Germany, a daily coming out in England in 1702. And by the middle of the century, there was an important provincial press, and millions of newspapers were being printed each year. Magazines and weekly journals began to appear in England in the first half of the 18th century, and the most important of them, The Spectator, set a model for journalism by its conscious effort to shape taste and behavior. Here was something new. Only in the United Provinces did journalism have such success as in England. Probably this was because all other European countries enjoyed censorships of varying degrees of efficacy, as well as different levels of literacy. Learned and literary journals appeared in increasing numbers, but political reporting and comment were rarely available. Even in 18th century France, it was normal for the authors of works embodying advanced ideas to circulate them only in manuscript. In this stronghold of critical thought, there was still a censorship, although one arbitrary and unpredictable as the century wore on, less effective in its operation. It may have been a growing awareness of the subversive potential of easily accessible journalism, which led to a change of wind in official attitudes to education. Until the 18th century, there was no very widespread feeling that education and literacy might be dangerous and should not be widely extended. Though formal censorship had always been a recognition of the potential dangers brought by literacy, there was a tendency to see this in predominantly religious terms. One duty of the Inquisition was to maintain the effectiveness of the index. In retrospect, it may well seem that the greater opportunity which literacy and printing gave for the criticism and questioning of authority in general was a more important effect than their subversion of religion. Yet this was not their only importance. The diffusion of technical knowledge was also accelerated, and it accelerated other kinds of social change. Industrialization would hardly have been possible without greater literacy, and a part of what has been called a scientific revolution in the 17th century must be attributed to the simple cumulative effect of more rapidly and widely circulated information. The fundamental sources of this revolution, nonetheless, lie deeper than this in change intellectual attitudes. Their core was a changed view of man's relation to nature. From a natural world observed with bemused awe as evidence of God's mysterious ways, more people were somehow making the great step to a conscious search for means to achieve its manipulation. Although the work of medieval scientists had been by no means as primitive and uncreative as it was once the fashion to believe, it suffered from two critical limitations. One was that it provided very little knowledge that was of practical use, and this inhibited attention to it. The second was its theoretical weakness. It had to be surpassed at a conceptual as well as a technical level. In spite of its beneficial irrigation by ideas from the Arab world and a healthy emphasis on definition and diagnosis in some of its branches, medieval science rested on assumptions which were untested, in part because the means of testing them could not be grasped, in part because the wish to test them did not exist. The dogmatic assertion of the theory that the four elements fire, air, earth, and water were the constituents of all things, for example, went unrefuted by experiment. Although experimental work of a sort went on within the alchemical and hermetic traditions, and with Paracelsus came to be directed towards other ends than a search for gold. It was still directed by mythical, intuitive conceptions. This remained broadly true until the 17th century. The Renaissance had its scientific manifestations, but they found expression usually in descriptive studies and in the solution of practical problems in the arts and mechanical crafts. One branch of this descriptive and classificatory work was particularly impressive, that addressed to making sense of a new geographical knowledge revealed by the discoverers and cosmographers. In geography, said a French physician of the early 16th century, and in what pertains to astronomy, Plato, Aristotle, and the old philosophers made progress, and Ptolemy added a great deal more. Yet, were one of them to return today, he would find geography changed past recognition. Here was one of the stimuli for a new intellectual approach to the world of nature. It was not a stimulus quick to operate. A tiny minority of educated men, it is true, would already in 1600 not have found it easy to accept the conventional world picture based on the great medieval synthesis of Aristotle and the Bible. Some of them felt an uneasy loss of coherence, a sudden lack of bearing, and alarming uncertainty. But for the most of those who considered the matter at all, the old picture still held true. The whole universe still centered on the earth, and the life of the earth upon man, its only rational inhabitant. The greatest intellectual achievement of the next century was to make it possible for an educated person to think like this. It was so important that it has been seen as an essential change to the modern from the medieval world. Early in the 17th century, something new is already apparent in science. The changes which then manifested themselves meant that an intellectual barrier was crossed and the nature of civilization was altered forever. There appeared in Europe a new attitude, deeply utilitarian, encouraging men to invest time, energy, and resources to master nature by systematic experiment. When a later age came to look back for its precursors in this attitude, they found the outstanding one to have been Francis Bacon, sometime Lord Chancellor of England, fondly supposed by some later admirers to be the author of the plays of Shakespeare, a man of outstanding intellectual energy and many unlikable personal traits. His works seem to have had little or no contemporary effect, but they attracted posterity's attention for what seemed a prophetic rejection of the authority of the past. Bacon advocated a study of nature based upon observation and induction and directed towards harnessing it for human purposes. The true and lawful end of the sciences, he wrote, is that human life be enriched by new discoveries and powers. Through them could be achieved a restitution and reinvigorating, in great part, of man to the sovereignty and power which he had in his first state of creation. This was ambitious indeed, nothing less than the redemption of mankind from the consequences of Adam's fall. But Bacon was sure it was possible if scientific research was effectively organized. In this too, he was a prophetic figure, precursor of later scientific societies and institutions. The modernity of Bacon was later exaggerated, and other men, notably his contemporaries Kepler and Galileo, had much more to say, which was of importance in the advance of science. Nor did his successors adhere so closely as he would have wished to a program of practical discovery of new arts, endowments, and commodities for the bettering of man's life. That is, to a scientifically dominated technological society. Nevertheless, he rightly acquired something of the status of a mythological figure because he went to the heart of the matter in his advocacy of observation and experiment instead of deduction from a prior principle. Appropriately, he is said even to have achieved scientific martyrdom, having caught cold while stuffing a fowl with snow one freezing March day, in order to observe the effects of refrigeration upon the flesh. 40 years later, his central ideas were the commonplace of scientific discourse. The management of this great machine of the world, said an English scientist in the 1660s, can be explained only by the experimental and mechanical philosophers. Here were the ideas which Bacon would have understood and approved, and which are central to the world which we still inhabit. Ever since the 17th century, it has been a characteristic of the scientist that he answers questions by means of experiment, and for a long time, it was to lead to new attempts to understand what was revealed by these experiments by constructing systems. This led at first to concentration on the physical phenomena which could best be observed and measured by the techniques available. Technological innovation had risen from the slow accretion of skills by European workmen over centuries. These skills could now be directed to the solution of problems which would in turn permit the solution of other intellectual problems. The invention of logarithms and calculus was a part of the instrumentation which had, among other components, the building of better clocks and optical instruments. When the clockmaker's art took a great stride forward with the 17th century introduction of the pendulum as a controlling device it turn, in turn made the measurement of time by precision instruments and therefore astronomy much easier. With the telescope came new opportunities to scrutinize the heavens. Harvey discovered the circulation of the blood as a result of a theoretical investigation by experiment. But how circulation took place was only made comprehensible when the microscope made it possible to see the tiny vessels through which blood flowed. Telescopic and microscopic observation were not only central to the discoveries of scientific revolution, moreover, but made visible to layman something of what was implied in a new world outlook.